On this channel, we spend a lot of time talking about downplayed Nintendo games. We talk about games that the gaming media love to pretend were bad or try to ignore the significance of, right? There are dozens and dozens examples over the past several years of loan, but for a very long time, I've been wanting to put together a list of the games that I felt were the most disrespected, right? These are the top 10 downplayed games on Nintendo hardware. Right off the bat, we have a bit of a weird one. Fire Emblem Awakening. Now, this is considered one of the best games on 3DS and was a huge hit when it came out, but there is no denying, to a certain extent, it has been downplayed. What do I mean by that? Hardcore fans of older games have desperately tried over the past decade to pretend that Awakening was a major shift in tone for the franchise, that it casualized it, that it ruined the entire thing. But in reality, Awakening is what saved the franchise, right? Everything the franchise did up to this point came together in this wonderful, wonderful RPG on 3DS. But even now, you'll see people pretend this killed the franchise, right? They liked it better when it was obscure and when nobody even knew what it was, right? The the attempts at creating this narrative that modern Fire Emblem games are bad has persisted over the past decade, even when it doesn't really make any sense. Fates sold more than this, Three Houses sold more than this. Like, the franchise is bigger than ever, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And yet, people love to disrespect Awakening. I think when this game finally gets re-released, I think a lot of new players are going to be very, very surprised at how good this game actually is. Because to this day, this remains one of my absolute favorite games on the 3DS. Everybody knew this was going to be a hit right when it was shown off. The idea was new and interesting. The game was colorful. The fact that Nintendo was finally producing their own online shooter was a unique idea. This was a phenomenon waiting to happen. And the game did extraordinarily well. It's one of Nintendo's biggest new IPs. It's phenomenally popular. And yet there remains a subset of Nintendo fanboys that love to pretend as if this game is not a big deal. There are a lot of people that will complain every time Splatoon is shown off during a Nintendo Direct, right? There are a lot of people who like to say the game isn't very well thought out or isn't very original or isn't a whole lot of fun. And it couldn't be more obvious that these people have no idea what they're talking about, right? Going into the release of both Splatoon 2 and 3, we had to deal with people who were insisting that like the games had not changed enough from the previous entries. And that's obviously not true if you actually play the games, but that's going to be a reoccurring theme of this list is the vast majority of people complaining about these titles really have no idea what these games are like at all, right? Splatoon, everything about the design, about the update schedule, about the way the game is handled, it's very, very deliberate. It's always evolving. They're always doing new and interesting things. And to this day, I consider this one of the most interesting new IPs Nintendo has put out in a long time. I think the franchise hasn't even come close to peaking. I think it's going to explode in popularity in the next 10, 20 years. And it's so frustrating every time a new one of these games is coming out or a new DLC is coming out and you see people like Dark Side Phil release statements about, "Oh, this game isn't very good. It's the same as the last one." Yeah, 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 yeah. And the reality is that just isn't true. Splatoon is a phenomenal video game IP, and I wish that more people acknowledge that. This might not be obvious to people who haven't been watching a ton of YouTube over the past 20 years, right? But there has always been this very weird disrespect to GoldenEye's legacy, right? In spite of being such a huge phenomenon when it came out, a huge innovator on N64, being, the game that proved that first-person shooters were better on consoles, especially Nintendo consoles. This game has been treated as if it's not all that interesting or special, right? That it was always very overrated and that it never really did anything noteworthy, which is, of course, a complete and total lie, right? From what I understand, it's like from salty PC fanboys who think Doom is better, but the reality is GoldenEye has a lot more going on. It has a lot more intelligent level design. It has its own unique flair, and it's like one of the best licensed games ever produced. Like, this is a title that people really need to acknowledge as one of the all-time greats. And I see a very, very stubborn refusal to acknowledge that. Would you believe that one of the best 2D platformers ever made was met with scorn and derision when it was first shown off? How many reviewers did you see complain about how this game wasn't going to sell Wii U's and how it was completely disappointing and how Nintendo didn't understand their audience? No, real developers were putting out games like No Man's Sky. Kind of funny how that works out. But Tropical Freeze was the reception to it when it was first shown off was always very interesting to me because it showcases just how out of touch the general gaming public is. Because people really wanted to act as if Donkey Kong was some milk to death IP when the last game in the series, Returns, was a reboot of a franchise we hadn't seen in like 15 years. Right? It was weird to me how they stopped producing Donkey Kong Country games after the 90s. But seeing it come back to such fanfare with Returns, and then seeing the same people who praise Returns turn around and try to say that Tropical Freeze was a massive disappointment. No. The reality was that like people were looking for something to complain about, and Donkey Kong unfortunately was a massive victim of that mindset. Right? I remember this game being criticized for not being Metroid. I remember people complaining it wasn't enough of an innovation. It was always heavily disrespected. That to me really demonstrates the mindset that the vast majority of the gaming audience are in. Where, like, if something isn't some big 3D action RPG with like a bazillion different romance options and like 20 different quest lines all going at once, it's seen as a disappointment. But Tropical Freeze really was the pinnacle of 2D platforming games for a very long time. But nobody cared because all anybody wanted to do was just complain about how it was a 2D platformer, how it wasn't pushing the medium forward, how it wasn't going to sell Wii U's, rather than actually evaluating the game based on what it was. Right? The reality is Tropical Freeze is one of the most disrespected video games I have ever seen in my life. This game deserves a lot more praise and attention for what it managed to accomplish back 10 years ago in 2014. More than any other game, I feel like this one should have been a major success. The sheer amount of self-important YouTubers I see trying to pretend that Luigi's Mansion 2 was a bad game is laughable. Right. The criticisms essentially amount to the fact that the game is a lot more cartoony than the original and that it has a mission-based structure, which apparently ruins the entire experience. It's completely broken. They didn't do anything good at all, apparently. And that couldn't be further than the truth, right? Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, Luigi's Mansion 2, is objectively better than the original. But a lot of nostalgia-blinded fanboys did not like the fact that it made radical changes to the formula, that it had a lot more puzzle solving, that it had a lot more going on in the mansions, that you had to come back to locations over and over again, that it had better combat, like that it had boss fights, that it did all this stuff that was different from the original. Like all they wanted was the same game again. Like it was very frustrating to see when I first started noticing the stereotype of people who grew up with the original who just can't handle any kind of change at all. But like after seeing like Luigi's Mansion 3 come out, be a huge success, um, and seeing the same people insist that like both of those games, 2 and 3, are terrible. Like it really needs to be acknowledged that the bias against this game is a very real thing. Right? It's a major reason why it's on this list. Like it's so disappointing to me that such fun, interesting adventure games are just downplayed in this fashion, right? These are very interesting, innovative, unique Mario games, and like to see people dismiss them for such petty reasons is extremely disappointing to me. It is crazy to me that we went through a 5-year period where people were complaining about not getting enough Metroid. Where's my Metroid? Why are you disrespecting Samus, Nintendo? And the moment she comes back in this remake of Metroid 2, oh, this isn't good enough. This isn't what we wanted. We had a better remake already. This isn't very good, right? That was the narrative for a good long while. And considering we had already gotten a new Metroid game with Federation Force, all right, this is the second game that people disrespected. And what you have to understand is that, like, with the way things looked when this first came out, people legit seemed as if they weren't going to be happy with anything. It wasn't until Dread and when people started realizing they're like, oh yeah, Metroid's back and here to stay, and this is the best Metroid since Super. But like, Samus Returns was the beginning of what made Dread great, right? This is from the same development studio. This really innovated and really added a lot to Metroid 2. This was a great remake, but when it first came out, during the first several years, nobody really acknowledged that at all. Like, all anybody wanted to do was complain about things that did not matter to the actual game, right? Like, this is, I think, one of the most embarrassing things I think I've seen from the community ever, right? The fact that Metroid has returned, but nobody cared because of it was a remake. Like, really? This game really should have gotten a lot more fair than it got. And I am still angry. Oof, now we're getting to the big boys. One of the most downplayed games ever, the new Super Mario Bros. Games. It's so crazy thinking about how much I played this game growing up, seeing how popular it was. My copy of the DS original got stolen from me by one point. At one point, seeing just how this game just seeing its legacy, seeing people like try and pretend that this game was bad, that it was uninspired, that it was derivative is like hilarious to me because if you actually compare this game to the NES originals, it does a lot different, right? It's a lot more fine-tuned, it has a lot better animations, it has so much going on with like its unique power-ups, its structure, its level design, like it really really brought 2D Mario to a new generation, right? Like people really underestimate the long-term success and appeal of these games. Even now, like going back to New Super Mario Bros. And not just the original, Wii, U, and 2. Like I find myself really, really surprised at how good these games actually are, and how the narrative pretty pervasively seems to be that like they're all terrible. Right off the bat, people were saying Wonder was better simply for having better animations. But the reality is, they really are about the same in quality, right? Like Wonder isn't like magically better than New Super Mario Bros. Just because it has a different aesthetic, right? In fact, when this came out, like this was cutting edge, right? Like to think that New Super Mario Bros. Has been disrespected this long purely because of the art style, because of its alleged repetitiveness, like it's embarrassing. It really is. These games are fantastic, and they really need to be given a lot more credit. Everyone who told you the controls were broken were lying to you. This is one of the best games on Wii U. This is the Star Fox sequel I've been waiting for since the 90s. This was an amazing journey from start to finish. I did everything in this game several times. Even now, every time I come back to it, I'm impressed with it. This is a game that was too hard for game journalists, and YouTubers to this day will try to hide the fact that they don't play games by saying the game doesn't have good controls, when in reality, they're just terrible, right? The game is phenomenal, right? But like more than any other Nintendo game I've ever seen, there was this very, very big push to kind of pretend the game was completely unplayable and completely broken, right? Like I don't know exactly what they were thinking with that line, right? The idea that the controls are completely unusable is pretty obviously not true if you spend like more than 3 seconds playing the game, right? It's one of those things that like just doesn't make any sense. It was something that game journalists made up, and unfortunately, the community ran with it for the longest time, and I don't think it's the narrative is going to go away until the game actually gets re-released, and who knows when that's going to happen. Although Tears of the Kingdom is a game that's been heavily downplayed by the gaming media, that's being ignored by critics, that's being written off by most people in the gaming community, it is a 10 out of 10 experience and is I think, better than Breath of the Wild. But at the same time, we really need to take a step back and acknowledge that Breath of the Wild was downplayed as well. People forget what it was like when Breath of the Wild came out for that first year, where everyone was saying the game was overrated. It wasn't. It had like an Ubisoft open world. The plot wasn't good. The voice acting wasn't good. The mechanics were lame. The visuals were terrible. They were drawn out. They were washed. They looked terrible, right? That was the legit agenda for a long time. And it couldn't be more obvious as like the game ages just how much this game means to the vast majority of the people who actually played it, right? And I expect the same thing is going to happen to Tears of the Kingdom, right? I said when this game came out that this would redefine open world games, that this would be the new gold standard. And although that is true, that's obviously true, the reality is that the gaming industry does not want to acknowledge that. Because in doing so, much like if they were to acknowledge GoldenEye is one of the best first person shooters ever made, that would give Nintendo more control and power and influence over the industry, stuff that they desperately do not want. Open world games were a big part of why people shied away from the Wii back in the day, right? The fact that like, oh, Grand Theft Auto 4 is on the Xbox 360, like that was the main reason why people picked up those consoles. Even though they were nowhere near as good. Like, oh, look at these open world games. The fact that Zelda is doing that but better, right? Doing Skyrim but better is scary for a lot of people because the narrative for the longest time was that like Nintendo can't do anything new. All they do is rehash. All they do is like do the same things over and over again. But like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom demonstrate very strongly that is not the case, right? The narrative that Tears of the Kingdom is a simple rehash of Breath of the Wild is really interesting to me because it's not true at all. The games are really nothing alike. And I suppose this is the same thing people had to deal with, when Majora's Mask came out for the first time, right? Where people were trying to say it's just the Ocarina engine again, and they haven't innovated or done anything new, and the timer was annoying. I'm seeing people complain about the building mechanics in Tears of the Kingdom the same way they complain about the timer in Majora's Mask, like, oh, who wants this? But the reality is that like these games are innovative. They push the bar. They're doing things that nobody else can do. And the reality is that like the gaming media can't bring itself to face it. Like the reality is that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are the best games in this console generation so far by quite a huge margin to the point where I don't think anybody will be able to catch up. And nobody wants to acknowledge that that's true. Nobody wants to admit that these are some of the best games ever made. What could possibly top everything else on the list? What game is so ridiculously unpopular that it could top a list of nine really, really heavily disliked Nintendo games? How about Devil's Third, a game that was developed by Tomonobu Itagaki of Ninja Gaiden fame with a new studio that people really tried pretending is one of the worst games ever made, right? Well, if you see any other YouTuber talk about this game, they'll typically try to say that like it's completely busted, it's not fun at all, it's broken, it's easy, it's stupid, it's terrible, right? Like that has always been the narrative. But the reality is that like this is an incredibly good third person shooter, right? The game has more complex melee combat than Call of Duty. It has unique boss fights, unique set pieces, a great range of weapons and things you can do to your opponents. Like it is good fun, right? But because it was a Wii U exclusive, because it came out like in 2015, right? Like December 2015, like there was this very real push to kind of pretend as if this is one of the worst games ever made. And that reputation has persisted even now, almost a decade later. And, as I've said, like every time I played this game on stream, like it is a reputation that it does not deserve. This game is a lot of fun, and I wish more people would give it a shot.